I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2021 Journal of Operations Management mini conference. This is our second year to have a mini conference, although this one looks quite different from our inaugural one, which took place in person a year ago. So as so many things have had to move virtual at this time, we've done the same, and what we have in mind is a series of smaller, shorter events. And this first one, we're very excited to have what may begin as somewhat of a philosophical discussion, but I think will quickly get us to a point where we can think seriously about new avenues and opportunities for publishing. So that's what makes this especially exciting. And I'd like to introduce my co-editor-in-chief, Suzanne de Treville, who is also here with us. Suzanne?
So thanks, Tyson. So about over 10 years ago, but less than 15, Mikko Ketokivi came to visit Lausanne, and he presented some of his ongoing work on warrants. And I had never thought about this. And as he presented that, I sat there in the seminar thinking, my life has just changed. And it has very much influenced how I plan papers, how I think about things, and what I do. I'm not saying it makes it easier to get published, but it has helped in putting lights on the path. So we were delighted when Mikko Ketokivi and his colleague Saku Mantere were willing to write a forum piece to explain the idea. And then we were delighted that they accepted to be the first virtual seminar for JOM for 2021. So Mikko and Saku, I will ask you to briefly introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours. Oh, I should announce that Mikko Rönker is the person fielding questions. And so there is a link where you can submit questions. And then after the presentation, what will happen is that Mikko Rönker, it's complicated to have two Mikos, will be selecting questions that he will then pass over to Mikko Ketokivi and to Saku. Great. So I'm passing it over.
Okay, we good to go. Is the font legible here in our slides? You can see that all right?
Yep.
Looks good to me.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, welcome. We're impressed to have so many people attending this. Thank you for devoting a perfectly serviceable Friday morning or afternoon to talk about warrants with us. So we're two guys who are in desperate need of being introduced. So let me just briefly, so Saku and I are colleagues. We met about 20 years ago at Helsinki Tech in Finland. And we are very different in our approaches to research. So you may know me as an organization economist looking at stuff like vertical integration, buyer supplier stuff, contracts, governance. And I'm trained as a statistician. I work mostly with observational data, deal with problems such as endogeneity and such. And Saku is very different. He's a qualitative researcher who looks at strategy, process, strategic change, agency, role of middle management, and he uses very different methodologies than I do. So Saku and I were just talking, and I was joking, we'll probably never work on an empirical piece together because the methodologies we are trained in are just so different. But we've found a lot of common ground in the areas of reasoning, methodology in general, research design, making sense of data, and presenting arguments. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of our latest article that looks at the structure of arguments. Now, Saku, would you like to say something to our audience?
Hello, thank you for having us, and it's lovely to meet some new friends. But yeah, let's get right to it, shall we?
Okay, very good. So we're going to talk about something that may first look unfamiliar to you, But we're going to try to argue that what we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so is something that you have been doing your entire careers, if only implicitly. We want to make it explicit. We want to show you a systematic way of approaching the structure of arguments, how to think of, how do I justify that I know something? Okay, so let's take a look at, so we distributed the article, the piece that's going to be published as a JM Forum piece at some point. We're still putting finishing touches on it. But here are a couple examples of essentially theoretical claims that you may find familiar. Factories should be focused. Innovative products require a responsive supply chain. Or transactions supported by specific assets should be internalized. Now, how do we justify that we know this? Okay, why do we find these claims credible, or do we? Why do we agree, or why do we disagree? Okay, so these are the questions. And just to set the stage, this isn't just about our field. This is about the general structure of arguments. And if you look at the word Stephen Toulmin, who is a British philosopher, he's written two very insightful books. One is from 1979. The other, I think, was originally 1958 and then updated in, I want to say, 2003. He and his colleagues go through a lot of different examples of arguments. So here are three different examples, decidedly from non-OM context. Actually, the first one is something we're going to talk about. Price fixing and territorial restrictions are anti-competitive and should be ruled illegal. We'll talk about an example in a minute. But look at the second one. Non-essential workers in rich countries should not receive the COVID vaccine until all essential workers in poor countries have received it. Here's an ethical argument. And one of the reasons this argument is presented, because in point of fact, in many countries that I follow, this seems not to be the case. And then finally, arguments about arts. Tolstoy's historical novel, War and Peace, that chronicles the French invasion of Russia in the early 1800s, is neither a novel nor an historical account. Guess who made this claim? Tolstoy himself. Okay, so we could take these claims, just like we could take these claims, and we could look at the structure of the argument that produces these claims, and then assess these claims for their credibility. Not necessarily truth. We want to be really careful with the big T word here, because what we're making are assertions. We're making claims to knowledge. And that's more an epistemological notion than it is an ontological notion. That something is true versus I assert to know something. This is not just semantics. Those are very different aspects of the argument. All right. So we assess the credibility of a claim by looking at the structure of the argument. All right. And Saku, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you think that I'm saying something stupid, or if you want to add something. Maybe we should, at the get-go, Saku, you're a qualitative researcher. Is this about qualitative versus quantitative research?
It has nothing to do with qualitative and quantitative, and sort of I've worked with Mikko long enough to have understood something about the design of quantitative research as well. So in areas such as operationalization of hypotheses, in making sense of what statistical results mean, the activities strike me as interpretive as they are in the process where I look at a bunch of interviews and field notes and newspaper articles or whatever it is that we're looking at for a qualitative study. So the entire process of argumentation, where you make theoretical claims based on empirical results, you do see see, perhaps the most significant aspects of those processes tend to be cognitive, where researchers are working on a way to move from those empirical data to a theoretical claim. And what we're going to be talking about today is that is not a simple process. So it's not that theoretical claims emerge out of data, be that data qualitative or quantitative data. That doesn't happen. It's something that we do. And so going back to Mikko's idea, or argument, claim perhaps, that sort of we're not going to be talking about truth, the big T, ontology, whether or not this is how the world actually is, but rather, are we warranted in claiming that we know something? That is an active cognitive process, and this is something that we'll be focusing on today. I'm sorry about the doorbell. The Amazon is at my door.
All right, so we just wanted to get that out of the way, that this is not about qualitative versus quantitative, and this isn't even about science versus non-science. This is about trying to convince an audience. Okay, in scientific conversations, we of course have different criteria, and we'll hopefully talk about that both here, and you can see a lot more of this in the manuscript itself, because of course scientific communities have rules that are different, but the general structure of the argument can fruitfully be examined by Toulmin's general framework. All right, and in the context of scientific research, and here's a philosophical fact. If you're a student of philosophy of science, you may have run into the notion of underdetermination of theories by data. Okay, so let us just, instead of assuming that this is readily known, let us walk through this just briefly. So the underdetermination of theories by data simply means that there's always more than one way to arrive at a theoretical generalization from a specific set of empirical data. And also when we use theoretical terminology, focused factory, it's not an empirical notion, it's a theoretical notion. If you read Skinner's work, he talks about the breadth of the task. That's very much a theoretical notion. When we use theoretical terminology like this, there's really no one best explanation. There are only alternative interpretations. And I think qualitative researchers are very good at, kind of readily understanding this, but I would invite all the quantitative research out there in the audience to embrace this idea as well. There are always different ways of making sense of your data. And then just a very kind of technical example. Let's say we have two alternative statistical models. Let's say one has a higher R squared, the other has lower, but the one with the higher R square is more complex, has more parameters in it. Which one do we choose? The simpler, the more parsimonious, if you will, or the one with a higher R square, to use Bosman Frossen's work, the empirically more adequate? So parsimony or empirical adequacy, which one do we favor? Well, we would suggest that parsimony and empirical adequacy are simply epistemic virtues. We simply prefer a parsimonious explanation. And when we're asked, why do you prefer a parsimonious explanation? The answer is because we consider parsimony a virtue. There's really no explicit justification beyond that. Same thing with empirical adequacy. So I think this is a manifestation of underdetermination of theories from data. The data doesn't tell us. The data don't tell us which model to endorse. That has to come from somewhere else. And today's discussion is about that somewhere else. Saku?
And perhaps, to kind of contextualize that a little bit, when we talk about the problem of induction in the philosophy of science, often we think, some of you may have heard the name David Hume, who, a British empiricist who kind of presented one of the most famous often findings in philosophy, they tend to be negative, that, you find new problems. In our field, contributions are typically positive, that we find something that sort of, we find a way to predict or explain something a bit better. In philosophy, when you find that we actually sort of, undermine some belief, where we've made a more lasting contribution. David Hume was one of these people. So he challenged our, the justification of induction, for instance, the famous examples that how do we know that the sun will rise tomorrow morning? We can't justify the claim, just based on the fact that it is risen every morning that we've seen it rise, because there's nothing in these observations that sort of justifies the prediction. Or say that I have a bunch of keys here, I let go of them, they drop, I do it again. Will they drop again? My nature says that yes, they will, because they've always done that. Yeah, they will. But there's nothing that justifies me in sort of expect or predicting. There's nothing in the observation itself that justifies me in predicting that will happen, or even Newton's laws or theory of relativity, whatever your theory of choice for gravitation is. Those generalizations are not justified by the observations, because we're going to have to take a step from observations to predictions or generalizations. But often Hume's findings are devious in a sense, and they really sort of undermine our knowledge in a pretty nasty way. But that's something that we can't really deal with as empirical researchers. That doesn't take us very far. They're kind of destructive. However, there's another aspect to the problem of induction, which is the underdetermination of theories. Often we can actually draw different kinds of theoretical conclusions from the same data set. And this is something that Mikko and I have called the dilemma of induction, which is actually very, very present. And it is something that we have to deal with in some way, if we're going to be honest. So we have to make claims based on our empirical data, and we're actually responsible for the claims that we make.
Okay, so let's ground this into an actual example. So here is what I consider to be the best example of kind of competing explanation, competing interpretations. Okay, and this comes from transaction cost economics. And so here's an example. And by this example, we hope to establish that this is not just philosophical investigation. This has real consequences in real life decision situations. Okay, so this is what was going on in the 1960s in the United States. So Schwinn, a bicycle manufacturer, was designing and manufacturing and selling bicycles in the US. Okay, but instead of selling the bicycles themselves, they would have companies like B.F. Goodrich and others sell, because you could easily separate the design and production from the retail. Okay, so they decided, we're going to separate this, we're going to have someone else do the selling, we'll do the design and production. But these are expensive bicycles, and Schwinn wanted to protect its brand. So it says, okay, even though B.F. Goodrich, you're selling this bicycle, we're going to tell you where you can sell it and at what price. So Schwinn implemented what are called vertical restraints in transaction cost economics terminology in the supply chain. Okay. Well, the Supreme Court looked at it and said, you can't do this. You're trying to limit competition. You're trying to create a monopoly position. You must be punished. And indeed, in 1967, Schwinn's vertical restraints were ruled illegal by the US Supreme Court. Well, Oliver Williamson, who was an emerging organization economist at the time, he worked at the Justice Department, and he looked at this and said, the Supreme Court is deeply confused. He has in retrospect called the decision deeply confused. And he presented a very different argument and saying, okay, I don't disagree with the idea of vertical restraints. So the facts of the case were not under dispute. What Williamson disputed was the conclusion that the Supreme Court drew from what Schwinn had done. And not to go into details too much, but Williamson's argument was that if you want to safeguard a high quality brand, you have to engage in these kinds of vertical restraints, whether you hold title to the bicycles or not. Okay, now, why do these two parties essentially completely disagree? Which one should we believe? Which one should we endorse? Was the Supreme Court indeed wrong? Well, we have to understand the arguments in their entirety to understand where the disagreement comes from. Okay, and this introduces the 4 of the 6 concepts in Toulmin's framework of argument. The idea that Schwinn used coercion to create a monopoly position is backed up by 2 premises. One is kind of the familiar industrial organization economic premise of viewing the firm as a production function, and another principle of per se illegality that comes from legal interpretation, history, and precedent, that some things are simply presumptively illegal. Okay, and if we invoke those 2 premises, then yes, we can interpret the vertical restraints as trying to create a monopoly position. Well, Williamson took a very different approach. He said, no, the firm is not a production function, it's a governance structure. And the function of vertical restraint is to coordinate economic activity. And these, again, then rest on transaction cost economics and firm level as opposed to industry level theories of governance. And using these premises, Williamson could arrive at the argument that maybe Schwinn was just trying to implement smart supply chain strategy. All right? Okay, so having explicated explicitly the structure of the arguments, now we understand why these 2 arguments are different, why you go from the very same set of grounds, the very same facts, to completely different conclusions. All right? Okay, so let's take a moment of reflection here. Without warrants, so without these things, so these are the warrants, these are the backings. Without warrants and backings, what do we have? Well, we have essentially 2 different arguments, 2 parties, essentially what looks like jumping to a conclusion. We see 2 conflicting claims about the same events. We don't really have any justification of the claims so as to enable the assessment of their credibility. No understanding of why we disagree or agree. No way of determining whether Williamson's position is a credible rebuttal of the Supreme Court's position. And then the practical question, which one of these 2 should we endorse? We can't just count the votes here. You know, if these are presented as principled arguments, we need to understand those arguments instead of just asking which one do you like. All right. So the Supreme Court in 1967 decided this is the conclusion. Interestingly enough, 10 years later, they've reversed the ruling and sided with this, which is interesting enough. So they realized that maybe there is something. Well, we need to understand what happened in those intervening 10 years. Actually, what happened was the Supreme Court started revisiting some of the warrants it was using in antitrust rulings. All right. Saku, anything to add to this? So this is kind of we've been challenged throughout the review process by Suzanne and Tyson and Mikko on the question, so what? Well, this is kind of our first so what point. Without warrants, we really have an amputated, seriously incomplete understanding of the structure of the argument.
Yeah, and sort of, perhaps one implication that could be easily drawn here is that a claim, a theoretical claim and a theoretical argument are two very different things, and we often confuse those two. So an argument actually has structure, an argument has justification. And that's perhaps the crucial point that we're trying to make with this example.
Excellent. So this is what sometimes happens. If you are presented with a claim, as we are, you know, as authors, we present claims, and as reviewers, peer reviewers, committee members and such, we evaluate claims. But what we really need to understand that we can't just evaluate the claim. We need to evaluate the entire argument. So I hope this gives us a moment to pause that, you know, maybe I look at a claim and then just, I'll see, okay, it makes sense. Okay, I agree with the claim. And then I say, okay, I'm fine. But in doing so, I'm not doing what I should be doing. What I should be doing is analyzing, evaluating the structure of the entire argument, whether or not I agree with the claim or not. It could be possible that I strongly disagree with the claim, but after evaluating the structure of the argument, I can only come to the conclusion that I completely disagree with the claim you made, but I can see how you got there. So I find your argument compelling, even though I disagree with the claim. So, and this is always a good exercise. When I see a claim that on its face just doesn't make any sense to me, I try to map out the entire argument. And more often than not, I find that, hey, there's actually a point here. I just didn't see the warrants that this author was using. I was kind of, especially if the warrants are implicit, what do? I fill in the blanks myself. I insert the warrants there myself. But if you make them explicit, then I can see, hey, this makes sense, even though I don't buy the claim.
Yeah, I guess we all have the type of journal review that of our own work that we want to sort of frame and put on our bathroom wall. And I think one type of them is where the reviewer says that I just don't buy your arguments, and you have a reviewer who actually can't draw the distinction between a claim and an argument. So, you know, they just don't like the conclusion without actually sort of taking the time or having the patience to actually go through, you know, in which way would we be justified in making a claim that to them seems unpalatable or counterintuitive or whatever.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I have in my early days, I wrote in my reviews, I don't buy the argument. And I would like to collectively apologize to everyone to whom I've done it. Because, yeah, it's not about whether you buy something or whether you buy the claim, but whether you find the structure of the argument credible. Okay, so let me try to make this even more explicit. So something that especially Suzanne asked us to do was to take a couple examples from empirical OM research and kind of walk through this. So let me briefly do this. So what follows, I'm going to describe 2 articles on which I am co-author, not to showcase my own work, but because you need the author's reflection to really understand. Because in the 2 examples, many of the warrants are actually implicit, and I'm going to try to show how making them explicit might help us. Okay, so here's one. I don't assume that you have read these, so I'll just briefly give you the context. So Virpi, who was a doctoral student of mine at Helsinki Tech, and then 3 economists at the Research Institute of the Finnish Economy, we looked at manufacturing location decisions in our 2017 paper. So the question was, why is the final assembly of this product located in a specific part of the world? And we were particularly interested in location decisions that ended up locating production in a high cost, in a high GDP per capita country, Switzerland, Finland, and so on and so forth. Okay, and here is the framework that we came up with. Okay, there were 3 key concepts that we invoked in our analysis, and they were specificity, formalization, and coupling. But unlike in other case studies where concepts kind of emerge from the data, or they're more grounded in the data, we chose specificity, formalization, and coupling as a priori concepts that we would use to comb through really massive and complex and messy data. Okay, so we took specificity from transaction cost economics and formalization and coupling from structural contingency theory. Now, let me describe the implicit assumptions that this brings into the analysis. Well, TCE is about cost minimization. So if we invoke the notion of specificity, it implicitly shifts the emphasis from the revenue side of supply chains to the cost side. And I don't think that, I think that in retrospect, I mean, the paper's been published, quite happy with it, but in retrospect, I think the paper could have benefited from an explicit acknowledgement of this, that we're operating more on the cost side than on the revenue side. Okay, and then the second point, formalization and coupling are two terms from structural contingency theory, which implicitly shifts emphasis to the structural aspects of supply chains. So maybe someone who looks at this and who maybe studies supply chains more from a, let's say, a power and resource dependence perspective might ask, why didn't you look at supply chain power? And the only intellectual honest answer is because we chose to look at the structural aspects. That was an a priori decision, not something that the data guided us to, but it's something that we decided we would focus on. So it was a choice, just like the power researcher who would look at power in supply chains would choose to look at power aspects, but the data doesn't tell you what to look at. That's a really important aspect here. All right. The other example is and this is more a practical. So this is an intervention-based research, design science research, whatever you want to call it. But we were looking at the organization of home care in the greater Helsinki region in Finland. So what is home care? Home care means that, that the city of Espoo, which was the suburb we looked at, they had organized this team of what they called traveling caregivers, nurses and social workers. They would go to people's homes and they would help them with whatever assistance they might need. Maybe Mrs. Johnson needs help with her insulin shots twice a day. Mr. Williams needs a bath once a day. So this idea that, people who would like to live at their homes, but need a little bit of help, it's just more cost efficient and just preferable in so many ways if they could live at home. Okay, so we thought, okay, hey, this is a traveling salesperson problem. So we have a bunch of people going to different locations. Let's see if we can minimize the travel. So what we tried to do is optimize the caregiver assignments. Well, one way of optimizing is to say, let's try to ensure efficient use of caregivers' travel time. Well, another way of thinking about it is let's ensure efficient use of caregivers' capacity throughout the day. So two different ways of looking at the optimization problem. Do we want to level the demand, or do we want to minimize travel time? And these are actually two different warrants, two different ways of making sense of the problem of optimizing caregiver assignments. And if you dig deeper into these two warrants, they are actually mutually exclusive. So we need to choose. We need to choose which warrant that we're going to use. We found out that this warrant is actually more effective in improving the productivity, the overall productivity of the system. So choosing this seemed to improve productivity. That thinking of the problem, framing the problem in terms of travel time was not as efficient as framing it as capacity utilization. Okay?
And Mikko, the reason here, just trying to interpret your findings is that, say, say Mrs. Johnson needs that insulin shot twice a day, and even though whatever the name of the Mr. who needs the bath might live next door, Williams, even though it seems counterintuitive to nurse whatever, that she doesn't actually go from neighbor to neighbor. She might actually drive to another part of town to give another insulin shot that needs to also be given in the morning.
Precisely.
Precisely. So that's the justification, and that's what we would call an inferential warrant. So
inferential, exactly. So we have different kinds of warrants, and this is an example of an inferential. So as counterintuitive as it sounds, when the nurse goes to Mrs. Johnson's home, administers the insulin shot, and Mr. Williams lives right next door, the nurse is prohibited from visiting Mr. Williams. And what the nurse has to do is to go and take care of the next time critical visit. Really counterintuitive, but from the overall system productivity perspective, that seemed to be a better inferential warrant to improve system productivity. All right, very good. So this is the last slide. So in summary, and then we're interested in seeing what kinds of reaction this has invoked. So to summarize, data alone are not sufficient to justify a theoretical claim. We need to come to terms with this. Whenever we make a theoretical claim, there's always something else. And we propose that thinking of the something else as a collection of warrants, and then looking at Toulmin's work, could be really useful in understanding in a deeper way what this point number 1 means. Now, and then warrants, every single one of you in the audience have invoked at least a dozen warrants in the last half an hour. You've probably done it mostly implicitly, but we use warrants all the time, everywhere, for different purposes, to guide our attention, to make sense, to help make a decision, and to present arguments. But if the goal is to present an argument, then we can't leave the warrants implicit. We need to make them explicit so that we can evaluate the argument in its entirety for its credibility. And we propose that in empirical management research, we use warrants to cope with the underdetermination dilemma, specifically to convince an audience of the credibility of a generalized theoretical knowledge claim. Let's call this an academic or maybe cognitive research interest. Or we can use warrants to frame a managerial problem in a way that enables an attempt at a solution. Let's call this a practical research interest. And Herbert Simon, among others, has written a lot about the importance of framing problems. Problems don't exist out there in the real world. Problems require an active mind to frame them, to think of the problem in certain terms. And then finally, this is one of the points that came up I had a doctoral seminar a couple of days ago on behavioral OM. If you look at the kinds of warrants that have been introduced to OM conversations in the last 15, 20 years, under the rubric of behavioral OM, we see a whole host of novel warrants. You know, we move from rational optimization of systems to incorporating individual biases, personal goals, stakeholder preferences, small group interactions. Chris Locke has a wonderful piece on this. I think it's POM 2017. So we're introducing a lot, not just new data sets, not just new research designs, but fundamentally new warrants as well. All right. That is our story, and we're sticking to it. So now, any questions that you might have, we'd be happy to address them. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
So now, Mikko Runker, can we pass it over to you, and can you share some of the questions that have come from the audience?
Well, there hasn't been many this far. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
There hasn't been many this far, so
Suzanne, would it make sense for us to perhaps start with any comments or questions that the the editors have, and perhaps that could also, get the audience going a little bit. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think that would make sense because some of the questions are not really related to your paper, like the general questions about qualitative and quantitative research and things like that.
So in that case, I'd like to take a very practical example that we encounter frequently. Let's suppose that somebody has some interesting data and they're looking at an area, because one of the things that always jumps out at me is when you make a claim and you follow this warrant logic, you stop saying, this is what is true, as Mikko Ketokivi says, we're not using the T word, but it is, I have to make a decision. And whichever decision I make, I don't know, there's going to be some risk or, some bad things that can happen to me. But I would like to really think through what are the implications of either decision, and I will formulate that in the form of claims. All right, so here we have this author team, and they've got this nice data, but given the fact that data analysis is fraught with with pitfalls, there are some signs that they can't rule out endogeneity. So what they do is they submit the paper and they make their truth claims, and then the reviewers say, this, you're generalizing, you can't generalize, and endogeneity is the kiss of death. So unfortunately, even though we're very impressed by your data and we think that the area is interesting, we are going to recommend that the paper be rejected. And of course, as EICs, Tyson and I sit there with, we don't exactly have tears pouring down our faces, but we are thinking there's got to be a better way to run a railroad. And it seems to me that Warrant might provide a way for the authors to argue for why what they're saying is worth considering, recognizing that it is not generalizable because of endogeneity. And Saku has done some interesting work in terms of thought experiments. And so I have, before having this whole discussion with you two on warrants, I had already suggested to authors that one approach to take might be to frame things as a thought experiment as opposed to a truth claim. So I think truth claims just simply get us into trouble. So a few thoughts that I'd love to hear you address.
Okay, well, let me mention, Dan Guide and I, we got the endogeneity ball rolling, I guess. So, seeing as how I'm one of the guilty people. So for so many years in OM research, there was the implicit warrant that endogeneity is not a problem. Okay, and Dan and I thought, okay, we can't do this. We can't simply automatically grant the warrant that observational data doesn't have an endogeneity problem. Okay, so, and I think it's a warrant. This idea that I'm going to assume that there is no endogeneity problem. And then Dan and I decided in our 2015 editorial, we said, okay, we need to raise the bar a little. You have to, that warrant is no longer automatically going to be granted. I mean, there are many things you can do empirically, and Mikko knows much more about them than I do. But what I would like to emphasize is, and I think this relates to the notion of thought experiment, there is so much you can also do conceptually and theoretically to address the notion of endogeneity. So the idea that now we need to learn all these new inferential tools, that's not the solution to this. So look, the solution to this would start at thinking of what kinds of warrants could we start using instead of essentially the assumption that endogeneity is not an issue. And maybe Mikko Rönkä has maybe, your experience is more up to date with JOM on this because you've seen more what's been happening in the last 2 years. I wonder if you have any more recent thoughts on this.
Sorry, I was trying to manage the questions. So
Okay, all right.
Your question, because
No,
I can't copy paste from the chat for some reason.
Gotcha. I was just asking if there is something. What's the latest on endogeneity at JOM? What do you see? How do you see authors tackling the endogeneity, either theoretically or empirically? Has there been anything that has happened in the last couple of years that might merit attention here?
Well, since you asked, I could go on for hours about that, but just briefly.
Try 2 minutes.
Your article, particularly the editorial about the endogeneity, certainly has raised interest on the topic, and I can see rather mechanistic applications of instrumental variables. So instead of now claiming that you don't have endogeneity, we have authors using two-stage least squares and then claiming that some variables are valid instruments without the theoretical justification. So I'm not sure if understanding of the issue has improved, but the issues receive more attention and the tools for, and that there are more techniques being applied, but whether they're applied correctly is another matter. So they are mostly like, if you apply two-stage least squares, therefore no endogeneity problem, that kind of argument. So that's the most common way. And of course, some authors do it correctly, and that they discuss the drawbacks. I quite like Quanchi's paper that I don't remember which one, where he spends a long time talking about endogeneity, and then he concludes that in their case, the best way to address the issue is simply to choose as many relevant controls as possible. So yeah.
Yeah, and you know, this is a slow process. This takes time. And if it took the Supreme Court 10 years to reverse the Schwind ruling, I don't think that we should be expecting things to happen very quickly. And there's, of course, an advantage to things proceeding slowly, because then we can think through these things instead of making really, and what Dan and I we wanted to give the spark. Okay, let's start thinking about this. But to our delight, we immediately saw authors actually trying to do something about it. Very interesting theoretical ways of thinking about it, counterfactual ways of thinking about it, and indeed also, you know, longitudinal research designs, you know, instrumental variables. So we immediately saw a response from the field, which was really encouraging to us. But it is a slow process. And of course, there's going to be missteps and all that. But in general, I'm really happy with what I've seen in JOM and OM more broadly in the last 6 years.
One thing to add in, just to kind of close the loop, that what I think is likely is that as authors start from, I'm going to make my warrants clear, they are more likely to handle endogeneity well and then leave the next authors in a good position. And also they can dial back their claims, because not everything has to be generalizable, you know, that we are emphasizing empirically grounded research questions. If your contribution is a research question and you have presented strong arguments for why this should be studied, that can be very useful.
Yeah, and all research has to establish some sense of generality. If you study Honda supply chain, that can't be just about Honda supply chain. There has to be a sense of generality. And I think that warrants will give us a better understanding of the boundary conditions. For instance, again, going back to the production location, now that I realized that we kind of smuggled in the cost minimization warrant there, that establishes a really clear and important boundary conditions for the claims that we make in that paper. And now I see that some questions are addressing this. What can we do differently? If I were to rewrite that paper, I would write cost minimization there explicitly and say, we're looking at the cost side, not the revenue side. If you have ideas on the revenue side, we'd love to hear them. We'd love to see what happens to our claim if we adopt a different warrant. Because ultimately what we want to understand is, why is this thing assembled in the location where it's assembled? Okay, and different warrants and different argument structures can shed different kinds of insight on this. That's the key. That's the key.
There's a practical question in the chat, and that is, are your slides available?
Yes, I can send them to Suzanne, and you can post them on the JOM website. So absolutely.
But we're starting to get a lot of good questions coming in now, and I just want to ensure, Mikko, Ranko, you're able to capture them from the Q&A and/or the chat.
I can use the Q&A. I can't copy paste from chat, and I'm just too slow of a typist to type from chat. So
okay, yeah, no retyping should be needed. So just to remind our attendees that if you do have a question, you're going to have to type it in to submit it, and do that on the Q&A feature in Zoom or the website. We had been suggesting using the chat, but that's turning out to not be as useful. So I've got one question, and then I think we should move on to audience questions. Maybe this is for Saku, since you're a qualitative researcher, but maybe it was your last slide of summary that began with what I thought was a fairly provocative but important statement, where you said data alone are insufficient to justify theory. So how would this resonate with a grounded theory, purely inductive case study type researcher who claims that you let the data lead you completely? In fact, you don't even go to the literature. You just start with collecting data and you purely inductively arrive at your findings and results.
Okay,
so
you kind of make my heart sing by that question, because it's one of my absolute pet peeves of all time. You can't let the data just guide you. There's no way to do that. And not mentioning sort of, I think the sort of Kathy Eisenhardt, I find this is one of the most insightful theoreticians in our field, and sort of, for very good reasons. Her citation counts are amazing. However, I think a very regrettable part of that legacy is that people are thinking that theoretical claims somehow emerged out of data. And sort of by being compliant to a particular normative notion of what the theory design should look, research design should look like, somehow you're off the hook. That we've just talked about the underdetermination of theories. So this is something that kind of a philosophy of science 101 course will teach you, that there is absolutely no way that you can translate empirical findings into theoretical claims. So there's no induction way of doing, induction. If you read the work of Francis Bacon, who was one of the early, and Mikko and I have actually been doing that recently. These people knew it already when they were trying to sort of push out of the dogma of the Catholic Church and started doing empirical research. They realized that induction is not a simple mechanistic process where you count swans at the lakeside and sort of do a little table of you see this many white swans and then on. So that's not how you, because that the claim that those swans are white, that's not a theoretical claim. So it's just an empirical generalization.
Precisely.
From any kind of data set, be it quantitative or qualitative, whatever it is. So it makes no difference whatsoever if it's, because quant data also you have to theorize. So there's no simple way that a statistical test can somehow and that's what I teach to my PhD students. I'm just teaching a qualitative course as we go, and sort of what I'm trying to teach them is sort of compliance to some authority. Be it Kathy Eisenhardt or sort of whomever, Danny Gioia is actually highly resistant of sort of becoming a normative authority. If you read his work, sort of he's actually he was pushing back against the notion of there being a Gioia method, for all this time. Sort of you read those things carefully, sort of he's not advocating that sort of his way of doing research, his practice of doing research, even however compelling it is, as Eisenhardt's practice is highly compelling. That's the reason why it's so popular, that it's some kind of a surefire mechanistic way of mechanically inducing theory out of data. So that doesn't happen. So and that yeah, it's one of my and the underdetermination of theories that we're talking about. That's, I think we can rest assured that that is a real dilemma that we have to struggle with.
Yeah, and this is how we start the paper. If theories could emerge inductively from data, there would be no underdetermination problem. But to cite the old maxim, that's an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence, which we don't have. So, or, you know, if you're an OM person, think of Skinner's notion of factory focus and think of narrow product mix. Narrow product mix is, you know, has been used as a metric. How do you go from one to the other? How do you go from the notion of focused factory to narrow product mix? I can remember at least 3 different contexts in which Skinner very strongly argued that it's not about product mix. And yeah, people would go back to the product mix. So something has to happen there. Maybe in some context, narrow product mix is a good operationalization, but you have to make that translation explicitly instead of arguing that, hey, I can deduce. I can use deductive reasoning and go from focus to the notion of narrow product mix. That simply isn't possible. There has to be translation, and I'd love to see that translation explicitly when I read a focused factory paper.
Yeah, and when we talk about really rigor in qualitative research, in particular, which I know something about, the rigor in an inductive study, sort of, you know, rigor doesn't mean that you're showing 100% compliance to you know something that somebody else has suggested. So rigor in inductive reasoning is that you take full accountability of the claims that you make, and you take extra effort to justify them. So you know the fact that theory doesn't emerge from data doesn't mean that you can retrofit your data to sort of, you know, claim whatever you want. So I think that's a completely false dichotomy. So it has nothing to do with sort of, you know, the recognition of warrants and the active responsibility of reasoning for any kind of scholar. So that for me that suggests rigor rather than, you know, so you know the idea that you can't, so that results don't emerge, it's not a cynical argument. So I understand that it's kind of an aesthetic compelling way of thinking, like Bach was thinking about, that his music was actually given to him by God, and sort of, you know, as a composer, or sort of, you know, the sculptors think about sort of that the statue is already in the stone and you just have to remove the extra. So it's a very beautiful and compelling ethos of what you're doing, but that's not a methodologically, you know, sound argument. So you being honest and sort of, you know, true to your data doesn't mean that sort of the results are there. The theory is there.
I think I saw a question on the subjectivity. So does this then mean that anything goes? Well, go back to the Schwinn example and you look at the warrants. Those are not anything goes warrants. Those are very established. If you look at the warrants and their backings, you notice that there maybe a better word to describe is the notion of paradigm. TCE is a paradigm. IO economics is a paradigm. Or the idea of the firm as a production function or firm as a governance structure, those are not someone's preferences and opinions. Those are explicit paradigms. Not paradigms in the sense that Kuhn described paradigms. There's a passage in the article that discusses that we're not talking about Kuhnian paradigms, but more Imre Lakatos, who was a Hungarian philosopher, his notion of research program is probably, so TCE is a research program. IO economics is a research program. So this is really about different, so paradigms are more like institutions. So this is not an argument for relativism, or you can do whatever you want, or you can argue anything from any set of data. You still have to understand that you're participating in a conversation. And these conversations take place within research programs or paradigms. So it's really important. Yeah.
The notion of anything goes, sort of that exclamation was made by Feuerbach and philosopher of science. And sort of, you know, reading his work against method. It was a radical book, but sort of he's not, anything goes is not a relativist argument, because what relativism is saying is that sort of any so there is no way that we can sort of justify one claim over the other. So that would be relativism. And it's all, based on the flavor of relativism of choice, is it political? Is it sort of, whatever? But that's not what Feuerabend is claiming. So he's claiming and pushing for responsibility in choosing the absolute best method for what it is that you want to understand.
Sure. Yeah. I
so
think he was.
Means that it depends. It depends on what it is that you're trying to figure out. And sort of he was, deeply appreciative of empirical scientific practice. When you look at what scientists do, so for me, that the claim that results somehow a theory emerges out of data, for me, that is a relativistic argument, in the sense that we're just throwing our hands up and saying that, that we're not going to take the effort to argue here. So in a sense, for me, that's true relativism. So sort of a cynical form of relativism, that we just kind of fall back on authority.
Mm-hmm.
Or sort of, basically that's an ad hominem argument. That sort of really, who is it that makes this claim? How confident do they seem? Do we know who they are? So that we're giving them a pass of actually having to justify their claims.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's true.
Yeah, we got a couple of questions from the audience, and I think one of them is important. And
okay.
This is maybe a stupid question, but can you phrase the difference between an argument and a warrant?
Okay, that's simple. I can give it a try. The way that this is conceived, an argument is basically all the components, and a warrant is one part of argument, as is a claim, as is a backing. So the argument is the whole thing. So you're evaluating an argument, you're evaluating the whole process.
Yeah. So I can. Am I still able to share my screen here? So here is the Schwinn arguments, the two Schwinn arguments. So the warrants are, so Toulmin describes warrants as principles. So these are principles or premises that are applied as we're trying to bridge the grounds to the claims. So viewing the firm as a production function or governance structure, those are principles. Actually, those are metaphors that we choose to just make sense of what an organization is. And then this idea that some things are simply presumptively illegal. I mean, that's a principle. That's a principle that's applied here. So these are the warrants, and then arguments are that's the entire thing. And then there's actually, in addition, there is something called rebuttal and something called qualifier. So there are actually 6 different elements here. That's the argument. Warrants are one element of that argument. I hope that clarifies.
Then 2 questions that have been voted up are, how do we make authors follow this guidance? And the second related question is, how do we make reviewers enforce the authors to follow this guidance?
Okay, perhaps I could take a stab here. So as a reviewer, so we were actually sort of throwing this around with Mikko before this meeting. So what is it that reviewers actually do when they're doing their job well? And sort of, there are things that are not just about argumentation in the review process, but sort of the most essential in a scholarly practice, the most essential things deal with argumentation. So the first question you ask yourself, number 1, do I understand the claim? So I do a lot of reviewing, I'm in several editorial boards, and as does Mikko. So, and I have to say that an underdeveloped paper is such that, especially with qualitative work, that seems to be a kind of a dilemma. You don't really understand what am I supposed to learn from this that I didn't know before reading this paper? So, that's the first question. Is it novel? So it's also part of the first question. So has somebody else already said that? And sort of, just understanding the claim is the first bit.
And this is about the claim now. This is just about the claim.
The last bit in the thing. So what is that that sort of is being claimed, as a finding here. So what is the theoretical bit in, that's new? Then the second thing is do I understand how that claim is warranted by sort of what is the the warrant that is being put forward in saying that here's my empirical design, here's what I'm claiming. Do I understand what's being said there in the first place? Is there any such thing? That's also sort of just a descriptive aspect of the argument. Do I see the structure that Mikko had in the Schwinn slide? So can I populate the boxes somehow there? Often actually you can't. So people don't really do that. And then the third thing is that how the way that the boxes are populated, is that somehow do I find that is convincing? So do I find that sort of can I find a better way of doing what would have been done, or sort of is there inconsistency? So just a prescriptive aspect of the argument. If I get this far, I've actually sort of done a pretty good, first of all, the authors, if I get this far, they've done a really good job. For most papers, you don't really see that, that far. And sort of, I think I'm completely happy as a researcher, even if the claim is to me seems to be pretty alien, or sort of I don't like it. I really don't buy the claim, or sort of it rubs me the wrong way. By that point, sort of, even if it's ASQ or whatever, I'm completely happy to let the authors off the hook and say that, yeah, go ahead, I think you should be heard now. So, the normative stuff then about sort of, the research policy questions and sort of what I like and what I don't like, I think they should be left to other arenas. So those three questions. So, to understand what's being claimed here, do I understand just descriptively what the warrants are? So what is the argument structure? And then am I satisfied with the argument structure? So prescriptively, that considering all the constraints that we experience in empirical research, sort of, is it fair to say what they're saying? So I think that's what you do as a reviewer. As reviewers, I think we should have, and the fact that sort of falling back on orthodoxy, falling back on all kinds of sort of frameworks and rules of thumb that we tend to rely on in research. So I think it's much easier. So the governance cost of the research process goes down when we can just fall back on convention. So as a reviewer, actually, I have to work pretty hard to try to figure out those questions. And I actually have to, if the authors are giving me something to work with there, I have to appreciate their work and also put in the work to kind of go through that, rather than sort of falling back on my own prejudices and sort of convictions and the conventions that I've been educated in.
Yeah, I think that we already do this. As authors and reviewers, we already do it, but we do it implicitly. So what are the advantages of turning it into something explicit? Well, I think the advantages are exactly the same as if I say, hey, Chromebox alpha was over 0.7, therefore my instrument is reliable. Well, instead of the reviewer just immediately granting me that warrant, which is not methodologically justified, if you thought Nunnally said it, you need to read Nunnally again. Okay, so instead of just accepting that warrant, let's have a conversation about what happens to the quality of my parameter estimates as my measurement reliability starts to decrease. That's the conversation we need to have, not some off-the-shelf cutoff that we use. Same thing with statistical significance or variance inflation factors. I mean, there have been multiple books written on urban legends in statistics. These are essentially warrants that we use. They're kind of cognitive cutoffs that make our lives easier, but suppose we take seriously the notion that we're scientists and that we're trying to understand the world and that we're trying to prescribe to managers. We can't let convenience take the front seat. We have to, I almost wanted to say at the beginning of the session, hi, my name is Mikko Ketokivi. I'm here to make your lives more difficult. Because I think But Suzanne, you talked about guideposts or you know, hey, can we light the way for you? I think that would be a cool way of thinking about it. Okay, can we put some street lamps here so that we know what we're doing? So in that sense, it might make life a little easier. But using these cognitive shortcuts, it destroys credibility very, very quickly. And I think that thinking in terms of argument structure in its entirety and the use of warrants, and especially the backings, I think it just brings light to the structure of the argument. That in and of itself, I think, will be useful. But again, and we'll be really interested in seeing what kind of an impact could this conversation that we're having today have to what we see in JOM and other journals in submissions and review processes, let's say in the next couple of years. So this is really an invitation to a conversation, invitation to join on a journey. Then, you know, don't follow us. You know, I'm the last person you want to follow in this life. But maybe some of the ideas that we presented have made you think, okay, I think I should revisit some of the assumptions that I hold and make them explicit in my texts. So I'm certainly going to pay much more attention now to the cost minimization at the expense of revenue side than I have before. I'm not so convinced that, you know, that you're going to see that if I ever get another paper published, you'll see that emphasis there. All right.
So perhaps, you know, Mikko Rönkkö asked us a question earlier, sort of, you know, about sort of how should we educate our PhD students? So how should this, you know, sort of impact on the way that we teach? And I think, you know, one simple ground rule is that sort of teach your students to think rather than to comply. So being a good boy or a good girl in sort of by sort of doing what somebody else has told you to do is not methodology. It has nothing to do with methodology. It has to do with sort of power, and it has to do with managing your anxiety. But sort of, you know, and this actually, it has some pretty deep implications for it. Sort of as a, you know, somebody who doesn't do quantitative research, I can still from the outside see that the way that we teach stats, for instance, to PhD students, you know, we could actually take this job much more seriously. So for what I see often in PhD education is that the stats course is kind of like a trial by fire. And sort of, you know, you're kind of taught to be afraid of and sort of you're compelled to kind of, you know, just try to get through that rather than actually figure out what it is that you're doing. So now these are your tools. These are the tools of your trade. And sort of, you know, this is how you warrant your sort of, for instance, if you're doing statistical research, you know, it's not that you ask somebody what you need to do and then you comply with what somebody tells you to do, but you actually have to understand the tools. If you're a qualitative researcher, you actually have to understand, you know, quite a bit about philosophy. You have to understand quite a bit about the tradition of interpreting things as it goes through social science to make credible interpretations. But as teachers, you know, it is our role not to scare our students and sort of, you know, kind of teach them to be afraid, but also sort of empower them. Even though these things are difficult, you know, our job is to empower reasoning rather than to induce compliance and evoke fear in those that are doing your colleagues.
Yeah, but isn't this, imagine that you're trying to learn how to cook or how to play the piano or tennis. If you go to a tennis lesson and say, no, I'm going to be taught how to play tennis, I think you'll be thoroughly disappointed. I think you have to take responsibility. You have to figure things out. I've recently picked up paddle tennis, which is a different kind of a mix between squash and tennis. But, you know, I realized from the very first lesson that I need to start figuring things out from the get-go myself. The coach can help me with certain things, but I can't turn to the coach and say, please tell me what to do. Then, you know, if I think that applies to doctoral education as well. Don't come to my stats class assuming that I'm going to teach you how to do research. And those of you who have, I know that some of you have taken classes with me, you know that it's maybe a little painful, but I try to teach from the very first day that, you know, you need to figure these things out. Okay, I'm there to coach, I'm there to guide, but I'm not there to tell you what to do. I'm not there to give you some kind of emotional or cognitive comfort or tell you that this is easier. Okay, because this is hard. This is hard, but it's not impossible. It's not impossible, and you know, you'll find the way, but you have to accept the challenge yourself instead of.
The practice of sort of in my qual course, whenever a student asks me the question, you know, what should I do? I always have the same answer. You should do the right thing. Just that you have to have a pretty good sense of why that's the right thing.
What
You want to do.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking that maybe we should go to Mikko Runker. We have about 14 minutes left, and I think that there are quite many questions.
Yeah.
So
can I say this before? You know, Saku and I are very happy to record a podcast offline to address all the questions. So if you have asked a question and you don't get an answer to it during this session, Saku and I are happy to record. So don't worry, but we have 15 minutes, so maybe you can pick a couple more for us to chew on.
Yeah, so go over to you.
There are 28 questions now, and you have answered like 4.
Excellent.
So that's going to be a long podcast.
We'll do it. Anyway, we'll do it. Yeah. I'm in a lockdown. What am I going to do?
Yeah, there's a curfew in Montreal where I'm at, so there's very few things to do.
There are 2 questions that I would like you to answer. The first one is rather quick, but it has been voted up. And what is the difference between a warrant and an objective or criterion in decision theory? And this is something that I thought also when I was reading about the second example.
Okay, so can you give an example of a criterion?
If you consider your second example in the paper, you have these 2 competing criteria that could be considered.
I think that, you know, minimizing travel time. So adopting the traveling salesperson approach, that's a warrant. That is an inferential warrant. It's not a theoretical warrant. We don't use it to explain things. We don't use it to make sense things, but we use it as a premise as we're trying to think of what is it that we want to optimize here. And then the other warrant was the demand leveling idea. Okay, that's another warrant, okay, that we should do only time critical during peak times and then distribute all the non-time criticals to times of lower demand. Okay, so those are
actually, my friends, this is a wonderful example. I'm waving my finger like a schoolmaster here of sort of, you know, what Feuerabend actually meant with, you know, anything goes. So in this, you know, we're talking about human well-being. We're talking about human lives. We're talking about human suffering. We're talking about the, you know, the home care system.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the understanding that you're focusing on the time critical aspect. You actually are sort of, you know, making that choice founded on what your, you know, research problem and your data is about. So there is no objective criterion in the sense that sort of somehow a priori some statistical approach to looking at that data is better than another one. So anything goes, and it's your responsibility to find the solution that sort of, you know, fits to your problem at hand.
Absolutely. And there's another assumption here. There was the notion of optimization of caregiver time. Why did we not look at customer satisfaction? Okay, Mrs. Johnson doesn't give 2 hoots about capacity utilization. She wants someone to show up at her door at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. to administer her the insulin shot. That's the only thing she cares about. Mr. Williams, who needs a bath, I can only imagine that if I were Mr. Williams, I would want to have the same male caregiver come to my home, preferably once a day. Doesn't matter if he comes at 6 p.m. or some other time. I'd like to take a bath every day, and I would prefer that the same person who knows how I like to take my bath would. But this is not what we looked at. We decided to focus on productivity of the system at the macro level. So there is a very, again, a choice that has consequences. Okay, so these are all choices. We chose to look at productivity, and we chose, between two competing warrants, and we found out that one of them seemed to be more effective in terms of improving productivity. But you need to see the boundary conditions here, and you need to see that there's nothing objective in our approach. It's choice after choice after choice, and we need to make these choices explicit. We need to be able to justify them and not just assume that, hey, I'm the objective scientist here who doesn't really make choices. It's the data that ultimately guides me to truth and freedom. No, we need to realize that we make a lot of choices.
Then another important question is that we have been discussing about the warrants and how they can be used as a part of the argument, and whether we should evaluate the structure of the argument instead of the claim. But what if a reviewer rejects a warrant?
What's that? I didn't hear that.
What if a reviewer or an editor rejects a warrant?
Okay, so what if, well, I've had many warrants rejected in peer review. I try to, first of all, if the reviewer understands that what they're rejecting is indeed a warrant, then I think there could be a useful conversation to see what are the alternative warrants here. Because I think that a good reviewer, if they reject a warrant, they would have to offer something to replace that warrant. Just like my dissertation advisor, Roger Schroeder, told me in one of our first meetings, he said, Mikko, criticize all you want, but make sure that if you criticize something, you always offer an alternative. So rejection of a warrant should not be an option unless you can argue, unless you can offer an alternative warrant. And I think that, I need to tread carefully. I'm not an editor here, but I think that, maybe editors could push back a little bit too. If they see reviews where reviewers engage in what could be described as scientific bullying and say, I don't buy this, or, hey, I'm rejecting the warrant without offering, one of my problems with the null hypothesis testing conundrum that's been going on for 50 years now. What's the alternative? SMJ banned the use of p-value cutoffs. What's the alternative? Now we see SMJ authors doing all kinds of tricks to try to find what is the warrant that can replace the p less than 0.05 warrant. So all kinds of verbal acrobatics on how to do that. But if I am an author and somebody rejects my warrant, I would probably, as kindly as I can, challenge and say, can we have a conversation about why, and then what's the alternative? I'd be happy to. This is essentially inviting the reviewer to a conversation on alternative explanations. I've always enjoyed discussions on alternative explanations.
Well, there's a question I saw from Mikko and from others had voted up. So I think, given that we've got a short time left, I think we'd be remiss not to address a little more. And that is, since JOM is a journal about not just theory, but also practical relevance, our practical relevance question here is for authors and reviewers. As we develop arguments and as we review arguments, is there a set of questions that we should ask ourselves about whether we've made them explicit enough?
Mm-hmm.
So could you suggest maybe a few questions that both authors could check themselves, reviewers could use as they review, that I want to stop short of calling it a checklist, but it would be kind of a set of check questions to ask about maybe the grounds, the warrants, and so forth, to make sure that we've kind of done enough due diligence in making our arguments explicit. So what type of questions should be asked there?
Specifically,
specifically?
yeah, I was going to ask specifically for practical relevance.
No, I'm talking the practical relevance for our authors and reviewers.
Okay, so not managerial relevance, but practical.
Right.
Okay. Saku, go ahead.
I think one way to go about this is something that I already said earlier, is that sort of, do I understand the claim? And is it novel? Do I understand how that claim is justified? In, how that the authors are sort of descriptively trying to justify their claim in reference to their empirical research design. And then, is that justification sound, and why? Prescriptively. Those three things, if I would see a reviewer do those three things, if I see those, see as a reviewer, if I would see that in the first round manuscript that would come in, I've never seen a first round manuscript that would have come in to say, AMJ or wherever I'm reviewing ASQ. If that were to happen, I would recommend straight, I would say that sort of it would be an accept recommendation on the first round. It's just that sort of, I would say that very few qualitative manuscripts are such that I even understand point one. So there's some, potential in understanding, point one, and sort of there are no sort of significant hygiene issues in terms of, how the research has been designed and so on. So then it's going to be the first pass. But those three questions: what is the claim? Is it novel? Do I understand it? How is the the claim justified? And three, is the justification sound? That's how I would do it.
Yeah, and we've been challenged on this. So, challenge accepted. We're going to try to flesh this out in the next revision of the article. I think we need to think about this. We need to think about this a little more to make it as actionable as possible.
But the thing that why we're also, Mikko and I we're very careful not to sort of try to create some new orthodoxy that, use the word warrants and sort of, draw a diagram like this, and then sort of, you're somehow automatically, mechanistically justified. So, it's a fine balance to try to find in how we write as well. But, the three criteria that I just mentioned, I think they're, we're not doing science if we're not focused on those things. It's not a scholarly argument if I don't see those three.
Yeah, and often
just take my neck out and say that that's kind of a bare minimum that characterizes scientific practice.
And honestly, often when I read an article, whether I'm peer reviewing or if I read a published article, it's really difficult just to find out what the claim is, what the claims are. It's real, sometimes I have to do this exercise with the doctoral students and say, what is the key claim made in this article? And it's often difficult to kind of to decipher. Is it in the hypotheses in a hypothetical deductive piece? Where is it in a case study? Is it in the propositions? So just identifying what the key claim is before you can ask, is the claim novel? Just the very identification of the claim itself. And now that I think back to some of the articles I've written, I'm not entirely sure I've made my claim explicit. So if I want to start pointing at finger, I really start by pointing them at myself and kind of then through reflection of both past and present work, try to improve.
Yeah, I cringe at the thought of sort of the work that editors and reviewers have had to do with my work over the years. So even some of the things that have been published in really good journals, the first round manuscripts, oh boy. Well, but it's a process.
Yeah.
So we have 1 minute left. Tyson, I think we need to finish at the half hour.
Sure.
So I'd like to take this time to thank Mikko and Saku for an absolutely fascinating beginning of a discussion. I have had a hard time staying focused because so many interesting questions have come in, and I'm looking forward to hearing those addressed. I would like to thank all of the people who have come and contributed questions and just shown interest in this topic. And I thank Mikko and Saku for what you're going to be doing to answer these questions, and those questions will make the article even more actionable, because JOM community, if we get this right, we are going to come up with better claims that will underlie better, more ethical, more responsible decisions that will then produce the option for intervention-based research that then gives feedback that lets us make our claims. Francis Bacon said, truth comes sooner from error than from confusion. Let's go make the right mistakes, and let's get it wrong, and let's figure out how to give each other a leg up when we get it wrong. For reviewers, let's really think about what the authors are trying to argue and see if we can help them. For authors, let's not think about it as a magical potion, but let's think about it as if we're explaining to a jury of our peers. It is a jury of our peers.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, why this is the right kind of thing to do. And it is 31 minutes past the hour, so I think we need to finish. So Tyson, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks everyone very much for coming, and we'll look to get this recording made available on the JOM website as soon as possible. And we've heard about the promise of a follow-up podcast to answer further questions.
Absolutely.
We will also endeavor to get up as soon as it's available. So thanks so much for your interest and attendance, and look for future opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.